Adolf Hitler and Nazism are synonymous with the 20th century's darkest hour, the Second World War and the Holocaust. As a result, historians as well as commentators from the fields of journalism, from the fields of sociology, tend to account for the Nazi phenomenon as almost an aberration to be accounted for, but not explained. The trauma of the Holocaust, the death of hundreds and thousands of Jews, as also the carnage brought about by the Second World War, makes Adolf Hitler stand out almost as an exception. There is also the question of how culpable was the German nation in this crime that Adolf Hitler had committed. Historians like Daniel Goldhagen have spoken of the German nation as Hitler's willing executioners. There are other historians who have exonerated the German nation almost entirely by saying that the Nazi phenomenon was something in which the German nation was not complicit. Looking at the problem of the Holocaust and the Second World War in this manner, the phenomenon of Nazism has frequently been left completely ununderstood. The phenomenon of Nazism has not been properly understood. As a result, there is a dark patch almost where a lot of things have happened which need not have happened. And the understanding of Nazism has been considered to be almost a wayside aberration in the annals of historical scholarship. Looking at the phenomenon closely, however, it can be seen that the German nation was probably not entirely complicit in what happened in the period of 1933 to 1945. It is fairly easy to make the argument that the German people voted for the Nazis to power, not fully aware of what this was going to entail. They voted essentially for the Nazis by not knowing what they stood for, rather what they stood against. The phenomenon of Nazism is generally considered by historians to be a variation of the broader European phenomenon of fascism. It has its roots, like fascism as a whole, in what we may speak of as the middle-class anxiety that began to characterize the closing years of the 19th century. With the growth and expansion of industrial economies in Europe, specifically the western part of Europe, and the concomitant rise of the industrial labor as a major social and political force, the European bourgeoisie began to suffer from a status anxiety because of their relative reduction in terms of significance vis-a-vis industrial labor. It is said that by the end of the 19th century, the European bourgeoisie as a whole was looking for an outlet for its pent-up social aspirations, and this was to find a shape, in some kind of shape, in the emerging tides of colonialism and imperialism. It is also said that when the First World War broke out, the European bourgeoisie, in its own way, greeted it with a sense of release from the tensions that characterized European society on the eve of the war. This is a very eloquent testimony to this is found in Adolf Hitler's own account of how he greeted the declaration of the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. He had greeted it with a sense of relief from the monotony and the decadence that he thought was characterizing Austrian society on the eve of the war itself. The interesting point, however, was that while the middle class went into the First World War as almost an escape out of the growing period of labor militancy, the experience of the war itself transformed the way the European middle class tended to look at things, and the German middle class tended to look at things, mutatis mutandis. One of the most important experiences that the middle class veterans of the First World War had come out with was a kind of frontier mentality, a kind of solidarity that people enjoy in the battlefield. The having bled for their country and having bled together, the middle class people came back from the battlefield with a greater sense of belonging in the countries that they had bled for and defended. So when the European middle class returned from the battlefield, when the German middle class returned from the battlefield, they found the very same prospect of an industrial labor becoming dominant in the political landscape all the more pressing. Given the Bolshevik Revolution and the promise of communism, the working classes were ever more militant and in an ever more strident manner. So much so that the German middle class, like the rest of its European counterparts, was faced with the prospect of socialist domination, of labor industrial domination, which was the outcome they initially wanted to escape when they were slid into the First World War. The main difference, however, was that at the end of the First World War, the brutalization caused by the conflict, the frontier solidarity that the middle class veterans, the middle class and the low middle class veterans enjoyed, the middle class in Germany as elsewhere in Europe were willing to fight the communists and fight the socialists on the streets, almost stick by stick, house by house, if need be, to prevent the gradual engulfing of the European society by the socialist forces. Fascism emerges essentially as a middle class response, a middle class reaction to the growth of the promise of socialism. And Nazism was perhaps its most successful form in the history of 20th century. There is a second aspect to Nazism that needs to be understood. Much more than its counterparts elsewhere in Europe, such as Italy or France, Nazism in Germany had a very decidedly clear, categorical economic agenda. On the face of it, this was mutually contradictory. Nazism stood opposed, if it stood opposed to anything, communism. Nazism was meant to guarantee the private property, guarantee the sanctity of private property, which could not be taken away by the socialist state, a prospect that had become even stronger after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So it was a middle class preoccupation of private property that had egged Nazi movement in a big way. On the other hand, Nazi movement was also characterized by a deep suspicion of the forces of big capital, of monopoly capital, and all that it entailed. On the face of it, this appears to be close, therefore, to the socialist problem, the socialist agenda of domination of the economic forces by the state, of state regulation of the market forces. Nevertheless, on a deeper look, it appears very clearly that a regulation was to take place only to the extent that big monopoly capital could be restricted, could be prevented from overwhelming independent private property of people of independent means or independent economic means, the very social constituency that made up the bedrock of Nazism. The individual professional, the doctor, the lawyer, the professional bureaucrat, as also the grocers, the merchants, the butchers, who are facing the prospect of elimination in competition with big monopoly capital. These constituencies Nazism tended to cater to. So on the one hand, there was a determination to save private property, to safeguard private property from the socialist onslaught of state control. On the other hand, there was the determination to ensure that big monopoly capital could not remove private property holders people of independent means from the social landscape. The third distinctive feature of fascism, and particularly Nazism, was its willingness to engage in violence. Unlike the 19th century preoccupation of constitutional politics that seemed to characterize the European middle class, and definitely the German middle class in its heydays of the national liberal movement, the Nazi Party represented that segment of the German middle class which was prepared, if necessary, to fight stick by stick the socialists on the battle for the streets. Having bled for their country in the battlefield, the middle class veterans of the European society, and specifically in the German case, the middle class veterans of the German army, when they were demobilized, they came to constitute a group known as the Freikorps, the demobilized soldiers of the German army who continued to fight socialism on the battlefield. The rank and file of the Nazi Party in the 1920s were inspired by such outfits like the Freikorps, and were organized in the 1920s by leaders like Ernst Röhm and Heinrich Himmler in the organizations of the Sturmabteilung, the Stormtroopers, and the Schutzstaffel, or the Defense Forces. These were middle-class veterans, hardened by combat, who were determined to fight, if necessary, the socialists out of existence, and thereby preserve for the German nation the values that they believed, the bourgeois middle-class values that they believed characterized the German civilization as a whole. The rise of the Nazi movement with these distinctive features takes place essentially in the wake of the political collapse brought about by the end of the First World War. When the First World War came to a close, the German military had been defeated, although it had not been defeated on its own soil. The German military, faced with the prospect of socialist revolution in the manner similar to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in its ranks, decided that it could not fight both the external enemy as also the internal revolutionaries. So the German military had pressed the German government, with the imperial government, to abdicate. The emperor had to go, and a civilian government was to be instituted in its stead, so that the civilian government could negotiate Germany's surrender, and thereby allowing the army to retreat in order and to quell the rebellion that was swelling in its ranks. It was in this backdrop of a heady confusion, when an empire of several decades standing and monarchies of several centuries standing had to go. The military, when it had to approach the civilian politicians to take over the task of government, ended up approaching the political formation that enjoyed the largest number of seats in the German Reichstag on the eve of the war, the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democratic Party, faced with the prospect of military defeat on the one hand and a domestic revolution on the other, went ahead and declared the foundation of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, therefore, founded in 1919, was established in one of the weakest times in German history, when the German state was at its weakest. And faced with the task of subduing domestic disturbance, subduing the prospect of socialist revolution, the Weimar Republic reached out to the German military in order to be assisted in suppressing the socialist threat. Between 1919 and 1920, the German military assisted the Weimar government in subduing the socialist rebellion. But these 2 years resulted in the formation of what were known as two major legends. One was the legend of German invincibility, the military invincibility, because the military had not been defeated on German soil. Not a single shot was fired in course of the First War on German soil. The army retreated in order. This led to the second legend of the Dolchstoß, stab in the back. The German army claimed that it had been stabbed in the back by the Weimar government in forcing to surrender before allies. As a consequence of this, having retreated in order, the German military retained full prestige, full honor, its entire reputation intact in public perception. Also in public perception, the Weimar Republic was beginning its stint with a double jeopardy. First, it had brought to an end the war by means of a surrender that led to the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. And second, that the Weimar government, a civilian government, was very, very weak and effete because it needed the socialists to be beaten back only with assistance from the military. In course of the 1920s, the vicissitudes that followed brought about one cardinal fact in German political life, that the Weimar government was incapable of standing up to any major pressure. In the eyes of the people, the Weimar government was not able to stand as a strong and capable institution. It never enjoyed the reputation that it deserved. As a result, despite promulgating perhaps the most liberal constitution in the history of 20th century Europe, the Weimar government never enjoyed any deep-rooted base support among the German people. The institutional roots of the Weimar Republic and the political standing of the Weimar Republic never grew any deep-seated support base in the German people, among the German people. The Weimar Republic would prosper only to the extent, the Weimar Republic would flourish only to the extent it allowed the German people to prosper, only to the extent that economic benefits could be given by the Weimar state. By the 1930s, Germany's economic vicissitudes put paid to this possibility, and the weakness of the Weimar government undermined the very basis on which liberal democracy could have flourished. The economic vicissitudes faced by Weimar Germany were almost factored into the Treaty of Versailles and what followed after. The Treaty of Versailles held Germany responsible for having caused the First World War, and Germany was burdened with a huge financial burden which was unveiled by the Reparations Commission of 1920, and the enormity of the task began to appear from 1921 onwards. The German government was presiding over the most powerful industrial economy in the continent of Europe. Therefore, the potentials of German recovery from the ravages caused by the First World War were awesome. But if Germany was to go ahead and comply in facing the burden of reparations, then on the one hand, the recovery was bound to be slowed. On the other hand, the German government had made the political argument that Germany was in no position to make the reparations, to make good the reparations obligations. As a result, they were clueless, or they were very unwilling to push for policies that could have helped them this policy of fulfillment. As a result, there was a lack of direction in German financial policy, leading to a period of hyperinflation between 1922 and 1924. The hyperinflation had its severest impact in the state of German currency by wiping out savings of the individual German citizens. So the economic possibilities of the German nation could be argued to have been undermined by the policies followed by the Weimar government. The German middle class found its entire savings wiped off quite literally overnight. And as a result, the middle class learned to distrust the liberal democratic republic of the Weimar Germany. The working classes, who had almost no savings to speak of, were much less hurt in this period, relatively speaking, and the upper classes nevertheless prospered. By 1925, there was a return to economic stability given loans from the United States because of international economic reasons. And between 1925 and 29, the Weimar government enjoyed a period of prosperity. However, the US capital that went to the reconstruction of German economy, as it were, during the 25 to 29 period of prosperity was essentially short-term and speculative capital. When the Wall Street crashed in 1929, American capital began to be pulled out, which basically meant that the fuel that was running German economy during the period of Weimar prosperity was suddenly beginning to disappear. At that stage, when once again Germany was faced with an economic vicissitude, but a much more of much greater cataclysmic proportions in 1929, the entire credibility of the liberal democratic governments of the Weimar Republic was absent. It just disappeared. It melted into thin air. In this background, the status of anxiety of the German middle class reached its peak. Having been finished off in terms of its financial strength, financial reservoir during the period of hyperinflation, the period of depression came back to the German middle class as a reinforcement of their greatest suspicions about what the Weimar Republic was actually up to. And it was in this background that all the political formations that had ever participated in any Weimar government was literally butchered in the political, in the elections to the Reichstag, in the elections to the municipalities, and the elections to the provincial governments. From a party of 12 delegates in 1924-25, the Nazi Party suddenly emerged as the second largest party in the German Reichstag in 1929, as the whole range of German political center and center-right, represented by the DNVP, the DDP, and the DVP, that entire constituency came over to the Nazi Party. And the Nazi Party, from a fringe party of the Bavarian, urban Bavarian middle class, suddenly emerged in 1929 as the second largest party in the German Reichstag. And in course of 3 midterm elections, by 1932, the Nazi Party emerges as not only the largest party in the Reichstag with 230 seats, it was also larger than the next two largest party, the Social Democratic and the Communist Party, put together. This is the phenomenon that we speak of as the Nazi Revolution, the story of Nazi ascendancy. The question that historians now need to look at is, how does this thing happen? Now, this has been worked on extensively, and like all fascist movements, the Nazi movement also seemed to have its kernel in the status anxiety of the German middle class, of the middle class. The German middle class was deeply disturbed by the prospect of the growing power of capital on the one hand and the growing power of industrial labor on the other, and that it was being squeezed in the middle. And the hyperinflation and depression heightened this status anxiety, largely because the Communist Party was another party that was beginning to flourish around this time, because with the depression strengthening the cause of German industrial labor, the Social Democratic Party was unable to take care of the people who were being retrenched in the depression-hit economy, and communist militancy was trying to give a voice to the aspirations of the German underclass. In this background, the communists were strengthening in such a manner that the German middle class and the German industrial and commercial elite felt very, very threatened. The Nazis had taken this on almost head on. They combated the socialists on the streets and thereby gained confidence of the German industrialists. Even before that, the Nazis had made two major political coups. In 1924-25, the Nazi Party, under the leadership of Gregor and Otto Strasser, with full support from Adolf Hitler, had begun to make an opening in those districts or in those industrial areas of Germany where skilled workers were beginning to feel the pinch of socialist mobilization. By 1927-28, as food prices had begun to fall as a part of a worldwide trend, the Nazi Party had also begun to speak of peasant mobilization. By 1928, under Walter Dare, the Nazi Party swept the Poles in Schleswig-Holstein, capitalizing on peasant mobilization. And the German peasantry responded to Nazi Party's agenda of economic control. By 1929-1930, the peasantry became perhaps the second most solid plank in the Nazi Party's repertoire. Even at this point of time, there was no guarantee that having won the largest number of seats in the Reichstag, the Nazi Party could actually come to power. The one thing, the clincher for the Nazi Party, happened to be the strident anti-communism that the Nazi Party represented, in line with the entire fascist movements that we see in Europe. Like all the fascist movements in Europe, the Nazi Party's unique selling point was its strident and relentless opposition to socialism, to Communist Party. And it was this particular dimension of the Nazi movement that ultimately endeared Hitler and the Nazis to the conservative establishment of Germany. Hence, although Hitler had to steadily move from 18% in the Reichstag to 33% of the seats, it was not that alone which guaranteed Hitler's appointment to the position of the German Chancellor. It was the German conservative realization that Hitler was, after all, going to fight the socialists in a manner they wanted, and their delusion that they could control Hitler, that ultimately gave Hitler the taste of power in January 1933. Thus, the rise of Nazism to political power in 1933 was not so much a result of what the Nazi Party or what Adolf Hitler wanted to do, rather what they were determined to stand against.